being curious, being willing to move into a space where it's okay to be ignorant and it's okay to put up your hand and say, you know what, I don't know. Let's start there. Let's open ourselves up to what might be possible, is always going to be such an important ingredient in having a good conversation, but not just having a good conversation for fun, but really being able to open yourself up to learning. So think back to a big decision that you might have made in your life. Maybe it was yesterday. It was almost certainly accompanied in some way with somebody with a conversation. Your interaction in the words that you used with someone else helped you to think, to clarify, and ultimately to decide on a necessary course of action that was in your best interests. Whether it might have been a decision to have kids, to change jobs, to visit a faraway destination, you used the experience and the substance and the process of conversation with another human being, maybe with another non-human being, to help you to decide on what might be your best option. Why do we do that? Why do we use conversation as a technology to help us to learn things, to know things, to unearth certain things? And it's a particularly interesting question if you think about it in the context of our modern scenario of artificial intelligence, instant purchases, and even faster than instant justification that we're always all looking for. Still, human beings in this day and age, everywhere, no matter where you go, what language you speak, we all make use of this ancient technology of conversation, of asking questions, learning, experimenting, rediscovering, and even reorientating ourselves into life's big decisions, and sometimes small decisions as well. Well, that's what we're going to focus on today as a conversation, as a topic, as a way to explore this together on the podcast. I do have to give credit to, a number of different sources, but that I used and that I thought through and researched preparing for this. But one of them was definitely Theodore Zeldin's book called Conversation: How Talk Can Change Your Life. It's a wonderful little book. It's sort of 6 long essays adapted from what he originally gave as radio broadcasts a couple decades ago. And through its kind of whimsical but also really reflective and deep way of thinking through the nature of talk and why people say what they mean, what they don't mean, why they don't say what they do mean, all of these kind of crazy little idiosyncrasies and habits that we have and that we share in conversation. So it really is worth a buy and worth a read. At the same time, conversations and the technology, if we're thinking about it, if we're looking at it as a technology that we use, it's not new, right? It's a set of skills that we have been using in concert for, a little over 250,000 years. And we do it because it's a reliable way for us to make meaning, to recognize beauty, and to ultimately also find ourselves in connection with each other. We live in a time of unceasing noise and a lot of volume on that noise as well. So conversations of the enriching and even the challenging kind are really worth celebrating as a method that we use, that we reliably use for us to learn, to relearn, and even unlearn, as Alvin Toffler tells us, about how the world works and sometimes about how it really works. So we have the chance here to understand why conversation works, and also hopefully unpicking a couple of things that I've thought about, that I've used in terms of some research and a lot of noticing, a lot of being attentive to how other people can hold conversations and what we can use and what we can learn and study from them, and other techniques, if you like, and how to be attentive in those techniques for us to hopefully become better conversationalists. Because even though there's no real hard and fast rule book on how to be good at conversations, there are principles and there's things that are worth noticing in terms of how certain people can hold conversations and really do it in a really effective way, whether you might be doing it in an everyday business context or perhaps in your relationships with your kids, your spouse, your friends. We can all learn a lot from being and becoming better in the way that we hold conversations. So to start with a definition, it's always nice to go back to the root words and what they actually mean. Conversation or converse comes from the Latin, and I picked this up from David White, who's a big hero of mine as well. And he often actually mentions this in podcasts. And converse comes from the Latin converso, which literally means inside out, to take something and to have its inside facing out, which is really worth stopping to consider for a moment. Firstly, it's beautiful. It's a beautiful reflection. What you take from the inside becomes visible on the outside. But it also, I think, shows us at a very simple level what a conversation really is and what the substance of any kind of conversation that you're having at any time. And really, the truth of that is revealed in the fact that we are having two conversations at once, not just one, but two. There's the one that we're engaged with in the world externally, where we can hear the words, we can see the other person in front of us, and we're having this external verbal exchange with another person. The technical term for that is an interlocutor. And then there's another one taking place, and that is taking place inside our heads. And, where we have an audience of one, ourselves at that point. Now, what's interesting about this is that we're not just having two conversations, but we're having two conversations at the same time, where something that we're meaning to say, that we're thinking about, in using the mind's way of using dialogue to think. If you think about it, we all have that inner voice. And using that as a way, or recognizing the path that has to follow from being in your head into another person's head. And that's really what communication is, right? We have to communicate. We have to transmit a signal from one mind to another. But whenever you do that, there's always going to be a trade-off. There's a sort of a signal loss that we're often not aware of, but takes place when we're having a conversation, because you can't communicate as fast as you can think. And so externalizing your thoughts requires a process, and it requires you to pass through what you're thinking, the clarity of your idea as you hold it in your mind's eye, through a verbal filter, right? It has to kind of be shrunken down and refactored into certain words, and you have to try and be as precise as you can with the way that you're describing it, with what you want to say, what you want to what you're trying to ask, which always, invariably, loses part of the meaning, loses part of the clarity of what you're saying. It's never really going to be precise. And so the form factor of communicating what you're trying to say and how that ultimately gets heard and received by another person is always going to come with a penalty. It's going to, the price of clear communication is communication itself, right? You've got to go through the process of communicating something so that you can get it out there, but you're also going to pay a little bit for how clear you can try and make it, in someone else's mind as it is in your mind. Every great writer, theorist, thinker, artist even knows this problem, the problem of trying to transfer one idea to another. And I suppose it's just a great way of framing how to understand how conversations work, because that's at every stage of a conversation, that's what you're doing. And that's the challenge that you're having to face, to try and get what is in your mind and how clearly something is appearing in your mind to the other person, and how clearly you can communicate that, how quickly you might be able to do that within the rhythm and the flow and the energy of the conversation that you are engaged in with another person. And it seems that the best conversationalists are able to somehow kind of reconcile these two competing conversation threads, so that there's clarity in the communication, but not at a full cost, or you can mitigate the cost of the sense of what's being said. And a great conversationalist is also able to not compensate too much on the proximity, on the closeness of the sense and the feeling and the experience of being connected with somebody else while you are in conversation with them, right? That's often why we don't like being interrupted by someone else who's not part of the conversation, right? Maybe you're speaking to your spouse or to a friend about something deep, and suddenly, there's someone at the door, someone, passes by in their car with a loud honk on the horn, or, there's something annoying that happens, or a dog barks. It feels like you're kind of being, jilted or jolted out of something, because you're actually engaged in a sort of a fierce sense of attentiveness with the other person. You are in conversation with them. You're in a tunnel with them. And so to be interrupted or to be broken out of that really feels quite, annoying and kind of jolting, because when we're in conversation, when we're engaged both in our mind and in the process of the external conversation, we really are focusing on the other person and trying to make sense of something with them. We're sharing something with them. It's almost like you're sharing a meal with them, right? And it sucks when someone interrupts your meal, right? So being able to be aware of a connection, a thread that you are sharing with someone else is really a kind of part and parcel of understanding how conversation works and how good conversations arise as well, where you really feel like you're fast tracking so many of those moments of connection with the other person, with how your eyes are meeting, with how even over time your body language begins to mirror how you might be sharing and exchanging certain words or phrases, where you're kind of starting to invent and reinvent little bits of language together because you're building something together here. You're making meaning together. And that's why the conversational medium is not just about talking. It's not just about, my information is this, your information is that. Thank you very much. Sure, it's an exchange, but at the same time, we're doing that because we're actually building to something that we really want, right? And that is making meaning. This is why we use conversation as a learning tool, as a way to reinforce trust, as a way to build relationships, as a way to do so many different things in our daily lives. It's because it really is very effective at helping us to make meaning. It's an engine for meaning. It's an engine for figuring things out. A great conversation with a friend or a teacher, maybe even a beggar on the side of the road, can provide two individuals or more individuals with a chance at accessing a completely different perspective on the same circumstances. It gives you a chance to frame your thoughts or your feelings or your desires that perhaps up until now you had a certain perspective on. But now through that conversation, through the meaning-making process that was exchanged between the two of you, we can analyze the same set of circumstances from a totally different and sometimes even completely new perspective, thanks to a well-worded question or an exchange in conversation. And the beauty of it is that it doesn't require money. It doesn't require a certain level of education or permission to participate in. It's entirely free. It's entirely accessible. And all it requires is the volition, you to enter into this process voluntarily with another person. And boom, very easily, we can make meaning. We can use this technology for good. This is also why journaling and getting into a habit of writing regularly is such a great tool, and why, everybody from therapists to psychiatrists to, really anybody can advocate it as a tool to assist in helping us to make sense of and reconcile our thoughts and ultimately our experiences and how we feel about them. Because to see your own thoughts on paper, to externalize them that way, is for you to engage in the act of conversing with them, right? To get the inside out onto the outside. So, and that's why it's so useful when you're writing, when you're journaling, as a way to learn, as a way to make sense of, as a way to reconcile. as a way to re-engage in a different version of the story, ultimately. But at the same time, having access to this technology of conversation, this facility, doesn't mean that this is what happens every time, that this beautiful meaning making and poetry and great connection and all the great stuff happens every time. Of course not. Every day we are engaged in countless conversations that are, practical and transactional and have no bearing on the fate of the universe or the great poetry of, the mystery of meaning and everything else. Sometimes it's about determining who's going to take out the rubbish or whether it's going to rain tomorrow, right? You have your information, I have mine. Great, thank you very much. Conversation over. Regardless of the style or the purpose, we use conversations to reveal or to confirm knowledge or to confirm decisions around the knowledge that we need to take or that we are given. So that's worth mentioning. But at the same time, this conversation that you and I are having here is about the exciting kind, right? It's about the surprising kind. And for a moment, I just want to pause on that word, surprising, because the surprising kind, the explorative, the deep conversations that we all know and love, that we can all kind of think back to certain really important moments in our life and how they were accompanied by deep and soulful, important, revealing conversations that we've had, have all allowed us to surface something that we didn't know we actually did know, or helped us to completely co-create a new piece of knowledge or a new creative insight on a situation that we always knew or that we could always see in plain sight in front of us every single day. And conversations like these, the surprising kind, the revelatory kind, really provide us with that great reward, the ability to learn new things, to gain new things, new knowledge, things that were not available to us before. And it seems that there's something special in the process of conversation and knowing how to unearth them as a conversationalist that allows that to happen, that otherwise wouldn't happen if we weren't engaged in a process like conversation. It would perhaps be a little harder to determine. Great conversations like these happen because they also require us to engage certain really important human traits or human faculties. There's many of them, obviously. There's our sense of curiosity, our empathy, our ability to listen, to ask questions, to be creative, to think outside the box. All of these things are used in different forms and almost always in some way are used when we're having a conversation, even simple transactional conversations. But specifically, I just want to zoom in for a moment on two of these, and that is our attention span and our innate desire to connect and not just connect as in, I'm connecting with another person, but specifically the closeness, the sense of intimacy and proximity that happens when you're connecting. Now, when we're talking about attention or attentiveness, which I prefer as a word, if you remain closely attentive during a conversation with someone, you really come to see a world of infinite detail close up. And we all know that feeling, especially if you are physically sort of close. They're not 3 or 4 or 5 meters away. They're close by. You begin to become this recipient of all of these amazing details and kind of fine touches that become available to you if you're paying attention. The command of their bodies, their speech patterns, how their voice might modulate, how they say a certain word, how their eyes move around the room when they're thinking, how they use their hands to make a point, how they might hold their hand in front of their mouth when they're coughing. All of these simple, silly details that almost mean nothing on their own. But at the same time, as a person engaged in conversation and as the experience you are having in conversation, receiving this information, you realize that conversation is much more than just verbal. It's much more than just exchanging information. but it is an experience itself. And that's why, deep conversations often help us to accompany deep moments and deep decisions, big decisions we have in our lives, because the whole experience of having a deep, meaningful exchange with someone else is this whole sensory experience combined. When we're watching them talk, think, make up their mind, creatively suggest something, and it comes with being able to be attentive to these things. It's a sensory experience that people have, and it helps to reinforce the fact that this is also a connective experience. Because, and that moves into our sort of second area as well, where if we're connecting with someone, there's an intimacy in conversation that you breach, and that is not actually possible to not do or to not get into, because then it kind of remains at a technical, more sort of, less personal level, and ultimately you're going to run out of things to say, right? But if there's a willingness to move into that sense of intimacy, a closeness, a proximity, then that is where the beautiful things like trust and credibility, a sense of empathy, a sense of knowing, these things are really quite dramatically fast-tracked when we're in that kind of golden space of conversation. It's also a clue, if you think about it for a moment, why we're also happy to have very long and deep exploratory chats with chatbots. We don't have to have this experience only with human beings. It's not just because chatbots sound human or because ChatGPT sounds like my best friend when he answers me or when I ask him, a deep question, but rather it's because we now have an endlessly available, wonderfully easy way of conversing with a persona who is always listening, always attentive, helps us to think, frame, clarify, empathize, make meaning from our ideas alongside us, always willing, always generous to do that. And that's the real kind of aid, the balm that conversation helps to provide us with. It helps to give us, that sense of being listened to. And that's hugely important for our sense of psychological safety, for our security, for the way that we develop our identities in the world, the way that we derive purpose and meaning as well. For a moment as well, it also provides us with a glimpse of what happens when we think about the world without conversation, without this technology that we've somehow stumbled upon hundreds of thousands of years ago in caves. And if we weren't able to enter into this space of shared meaning making, right, what would we lose? We would lose such a huge part, a significant portion of our humanity. There'd be alienation, there'd be isolation, there'd be this unbearable lack of speaking, lack of talking. We love to talk, don't we? And it would send our species, I think, really quite seriously into this death spiral. We wouldn't last long, without the ability to talk, without the ability to express what's on our minds. We have to hear other voices. That's why we love listening to podcasts and we listen to the radio on the way to work, right? Because we want to know we're not alone and that we're always there. Someone's always listening. Someone's alongside you, a companion in the madness. So through all of this, we can, idealize and confidently make the case for conversation, right? But at the same time, doing the same thing for improving your skills as a conversationalist comes across as a bit less clear. Sure, practice and patience and experience all factor into this, but that's always the case with any kind of human skill or a sensibility or an idiosyncrasy that we're trying to, understand. How do I get a little bit better at that? Or at least how do I become more effective at what I'm trying to do with a conversation, with empathy, with listening, right? That's why we learn skills. We don't just learn them and want to master them because they're nice or because they're fun experiences, even though they can be, but rather because we're trying to get at something, right? We're still monkeys with tools, and we use tools to accomplish outcomes. And that's what we're doing with conversation. So while we can look at certain, ways of thinking about how to be a good conversationalist, I thought it might be better to look at this in terms of principles, at things that you can see as, well, this is a way that this works. From what I've painstakingly researched and thought deeply about and seen, practiced in the mouths and in the conversations with other artists who are in conversation. But it allows you the space to be able to try and to practice and to experience and to have fun with these things yourself as well, which is the key, right? It's all about learning by doing. So while the tools and the tricks and the sort of the things that you try might change, it's worth noting that if you have an intention to improve your ability to start or to hold or to steer conversations, that's a worthy one. That's worth, stopping to take seriously, because we have so much to benefit from doing that. Even little micro improvements at becoming a better conversationalist. There's so much benefit. There's just no downside. So here's, I've counted them up, and there's 8 of them. There's 8 of these, little principles that I've found. Many of them, pretty much all of them, I think I've tried out and, tried to make a habit of practicing them as much as possible when I'm speaking with people, whether it's my family, people that I work with, in conversation with colleagues, clients, and in different situations too, like, on a sales call or on a podcast when I'm speaking to someone else, not just myself. And they are useful in different, varying situations. So here we go. And I'm hoping that this is useful for you, that, there's something that you can take from this as a way as an invitation for you to begin your own study in the art and science of conversation. And if it's something you'd want to explore more deeply with me as well, check out what we do at Humble Mind or at alex-searle.com. I'm all about, good and clear and curious communication. Okay, let's kick off. So first one is about questions. When you're asking questions, because questions, are a kind of a spark plug in the engine of conversations. You need a question. You need an invitation to share information. That's really what a question is. And when you're using the tool of question, think through what it is you want to actually be asking. What are you trying to get at with your question? The art of asking questions is worth its own, field of scientific study. But I've seen a real wide spectrum of people asking questions, whether it's in a useful way and certainly in a way that's not useful. And I am definitely guilty of sometimes putting, too much preamble in a question, or kind of really not being clear about, what am I trying to really ask here? Sometimes it's good to keep questions short and simple. Sometimes you need a preamble, you need a bit of context and a little bit of kind of meaning behind why a question's being asked. And that means you need to kind of, split it up into multiple parts, and there's different phrases that need to be part of it. But whatever your style is, whatever your intention is, the most important thing here is to know what you're asking. And how do you know what you're asking? You've got to spend a little bit of time actually thinking about it, instead of kind of just flat-footed traipsing through a question, deciding what you're trying to, what the hell are you on about anyway, along the way. Like I said, I've been guilty about this over the years, especially in my podcast, listening through some of the older episodes. I'm like, oh, Jesus, get to the point. And I've found a big difference when I've actually sat down and just given it even a few minutes to just think clearly, about the person I'm speaking to, who they are, what their sort of general communication style is as well, how much, I am going to reasonably expect from them, and what do I really want them to share? What's the insight that I'm after? What am I not aware of in my life that I would like this person to share their perspective on? Or if they might have an interesting or more useful answer, what is that? What is that thing? And then work back. If I'm more clear on the question I'm trying to ask, the conversation flows better. And it also, aside from making the whole experience of asking the question less painful, it sets them up with a better opportunity at having a great response. And of course, if there's a great response there, or if there's a way to give me an answer to the question that makes me go, oh, okay, wow, that was cool. That then helps to springboard the next bit of conversation, the next bit of the exchange that I'm wanting to jump into them with. So the better I can set that up, the more time I can think through, what am I actually really trying to achieve here with this person? What can I reasonably ask them to share? And what is that thing I want them to share? I found it's a great additive for better conversations. Number 2 is also to do with questions. And that's this kind of little phrase I've made up, which is when you're asking questions, optimize for reaction and not just response. Okay, what do I mean here? Now, Joe Rogan, love him or hate him, is a real master at this. He is really, really great at being able to frame a question or even a comment and not only ask whether the other person agrees or, argue with me whether or not this is true or false, but rather focus the weight of where he wants them to land on their opinion or their view on a topic. Now, of course, it makes sense sometimes in conversation to have someone focus just on the facts and just on, yes or no, do you want this to happen? And that's cool. But in terms of, the meaning making and the back and forth exchange of having a conversation that feels like it's going somewhere, that there's generosity, that there's listening, and that there's space to contribute, a great way to try and focus your questions and allow someone to feel like they can jump into something confidently is to give them the feeling that they can be honest and that their honesty is welcome and that they can provide a kind of a complete and emotionally resonant response to what they're really trying to share. And a great way to do that is to let them know that really what I'm looking for here is your reaction to that. How do you feel about that? How do you feel about what's being said here? Do you agree with that? Tell me why not, and tell me how it makes you feel. We need to remember that conversations are not just Q&A, even though the first 2 here have been all about questions. But why we love conversations and the best deep conversations that you've had, that I've had in my life, has always been this flow where there's been an emergence and an evolution between, someone saying something, oh yeah, great, I feel that too. Yeah, let's go. No, I don't agree with that. Here's why I feel about that. Back and forth. There's a sort of an openness that allows the flow of almost anything to pop out and arrive. And that's where we want to, arrive at, that level of things being, able to surprise us, the sense of curiosity around what might happen if I say that. And we have to then evolve the conversation away just from facts, just from questions around, a response to things, but rather a reaction. If you're an interviewer, for example, I used to spend a lot of time interviewing people back in my days when I used to run a video production company. And I used to always try and keep in someone's, allow them a space to provide their reaction to something, not just their response to it. Because the reaction itself tells a story, and often the kind of story that we want to hear more of, rather than, their details on something. We want to hear your opinion. Why do you feel that way? Why? Tell me. Explain it. Explain yourself. I want to hear. I want to be moved. I want to be convinced. I want to be arrested by what you have to say and your opinion and your perspective on this thing that we both clearly care about. And that starts with being able to optimize for reaction and not response. Not that the response is not important, but the reaction is where someone feels like they can be emotionally vulnerable and open with how they really feel, with how they truly feel about something. So, moving on. Number 3, in the case of opinions and reactions, it's also worth thinking through what yours are. What do you think? What are your positions and your perspectives on the kinds of issues and topics and challenges that matter to you? Have you spent time actually journaling or voice noting yourself or been in conversation with other people where you've had a chance to really think through what you believe? This is a continual thing for me. I'm always really trying to refine what's my position on that? How do I feel about climate change? How do I feel about religion? How do I feel about ambition? All of these sorts of things that I think are interesting. It's not enough for them to just be interesting. I think the better defined you are about what you really think and what your reaction is, not just your learnt sort of informational response, but the more that you understand, why do I feel that way? And how can I explain and bring that up into conversation? The easier it will be for you to bring that into other conversations and to ultimately help to add the spice and the flavor that we all know and love in the conversations that you're having. Once again, journaling or starting a writing habit in some ways probably going to be the best and most effective way to help you clarify and to articulate these sorts of viewpoints, these perspectives that you have more easily as an ongoing practice, as a practice that's worth keeping for life, not just as a clarification and articulation practice, but also just as a great creative practice. Because you will find out, like good conversations help us to do, that you will end up saying or writing out things that you didn't know you believed, that you didn't know that you heard. Once again, going back to something that David White says, he says, poetry is the act of overhearing yourself saying something that you didn't think you knew. And that's beautiful, isn't it? And it's the same with conversation. And it starts with being attentive and aware as to what are the things that you think? What are the things that you find interesting and why? The next part here is being aware that conversation and who we are and what we do when we're in conversation is not just verbal. The body is also in conversation and very deeply involved as well. The brain is, yes, sure, it's doing, the talking and the listening, but your hands are involved. Your face is involved. Your voice and your whole body, everything is part of the engine, and it's also part of the delivery mechanism, which adds an essential kind of signature to the conversation and to the experience that you and the other person or people are party to, right? And so being aware of how your voice modulates, what your hands do, how busy they are. Do you gesticulate a lot? Do you not gesticulate a lot? What does your face do when you're trying to make sense of something, when you're thinking, when you're asking a question? How does your body react? Do you lean in? Do you lean out? Do you slouch? Do you sit? Whether it's an online or an offline conversation, all of these things matter. They don't matter to the point where you end up being overly sensitive to what you're doing and you eventually start to just, become self-obsessed with what the body is and you're actually missing out on the other person in front of you. So I don't want you to become obsessed with these things to the point of I'm just concentrating on me and what my hands are doing, because that's not a recipe for a good conversation. But it's good to be aware, and it's good to be in the understanding that the body is also a conversation tool. It's also part of the mechanism in the experience. And paying attention to it and to be aware of it, and to obviously, likewise, be aware of the other person's body, their hands, their face, their voice, what they're doing, is also going to help to just add different layers of texture to the experience of being in conversation. Number 5 is all about silence. See what I did there? Silence is golden, but we don't always make room for silence. In fact, I think we have a whole culture in modern society which absolutely hates silence, which is uncomfortable, which is scared by it. Silence is something that, for some reason, we fear. We end up wanting to just run away from it, and we invent very elaborate ways of denying it or to try and lessen it, diminish it as much as possible. Keep talking, noise, rather than sometimes allowing a pause, allowing a natural breath or a beat to just sit and arrive. Let it take its seat, take its space, and allow that to just punctuate certain moments in conversation. That's what we do naturally anyway, right? Silence is always going to be there anyway. But when we just change our viewpoint on it away from something that we need to fill as quickly and as hurriedly as possible to something where we see it as an opportunity, just to pause, to soak in, and to determine where to next. Okay, I've heard you. Because silence is such a great way of also showing that we're listening. Often when we're in conversation, especially if you're in conversation with someone who might not share the same generosity of being in conversation with you, you'll notice that they might be just listening to answer, or just, waiting for you to finish so that they can leap in with what they had in mind to say already, right? There's no sense of the experience of being listened to. And sometimes being able to just take a moment and have that pause work for you, work and allow the room to just soak in, and for everybody a moment to compute. Okay, where are we in the conversation? Okay, yes, I've heard you. Does that make sense in the context of the point? Yes, okay, I've had a moment to think about it. Yes, it does. Okay, thank you. Thank you for that moment of silence. So a quick moment of talklessness allows us to just refocus, compute, catch up, and to become aware of the wider space that we're in, in which this conversation is taking place. So really, silence and pauses are such great tools when we need them, when they help us to compute what's going on in the conversation, to take a moment, to take a breath, to check in with the body, and becoming comfortable with silence is such a great way of understanding the real nature of the ebb and flow of conversations. And so when you become comfortable and able to command a silence, to command a pause, it's one of the things that they teach, great speakers to focus on as well. Allow a pause to just be there in the room. Don't fill it up. A pause is golden because it allows that dramatic moment for everyone to catch up to where you are, understand, stop, break the interaction, or break the distraction, and become comfortable in the silence for you to then move on beyond that. Number 6 is to never miss the opportunity to clarify. To clarify is to beautify. I often ask someone in conversation, and I've really made a habit of trying to sort of catch it out and do this as much as possible. Sometimes it does come at the cost of flow, especially if someone is really kind of getting into something and they're speaking beautifully or they're making an important point. But I will always try to be as forthright as possible and say, can you say more on that? Or what did you mean by that? A lot of great podcasters are never afraid of being able to say, can you just say that again? Or can you go deeper on that? What do you mean by that? Asking for clarification and not being scared of asking someone to repeat or to just say more, just undress that a little bit for me. When you do that, you extend a gracious opportunity to the other person just to rethink, to restate, or to reestablish what they need or what they really intended to communicate, so that the conversation, the meaning-making project that you're both engaged in stays on track. It stays generous, it stays inclusive, and it stays effective. If I'm losing the thread of what you're saying because you're speaking too fast, or you're not allowing enough pauses, or if you're just using words that I'm not familiar with, whatever the case may be, that's not your fault. It's my fault, because I've got to make sure that if I'm listening and if I'm staying true to being attentive to you, I've got to ensure that I'm getting it. And if I'm not getting it, then I've got to let you know, right? So don't be afraid. Sometimes you just need to remind. Sometimes you just need to prompt them or ask them, can you say that again? Just talk to me a bit more about that. What did you mean by that? Good conversationalists know when something needs to be restated or even resaid, sometimes even repeated, especially if there are others that are also listening to the conversation as well, in the room or perhaps second or third hand, beyond just the two people involved directly in the conversation. It's a great way to show that you're listening. It's a great way to show that you're focused on the process of conversation as well and what you're here to determine. And often it's a great way to ensure that everyone else, if there is an everyone else around you, is keeping up too. So don't be afraid to clarify. Number 7 is listening. Okay, goes without saying, but there is no way that the conversation, the project, the technology of conversation can work without someone listening, without, hopefully, both people listening. We've all been there, right? When we're engaged in conversation with someone who is less interested in listening than you are. But there's no new insights possible. There's no new meaning possible without close attention to what's being said and also how it's being said. Listening takes place through attentiveness, through being attentive. And it also needs to be shown. I can listen, but I also need to show you that I'm listening and that I'm being attentive to you and that I'm not being distracted too much. It's okay to be distracted. It's okay to, there's a fly on the wall, there's an email over here, but all through the while, I am listening and I am being attentive and I'm following your reasoning. I'm following where you're going. Now, showing that listening, there's a term for that. It's called active listening. And it's a very powerful and often underused social skill. And it's underused because often, a lot of the time, we're just not listening. But it takes place on 2 levels. There's the physical listening, where you're leaning in, you're making an effort, you're staying still, you're maintaining eye contact, and you're allowing the information and the experience of the conversation to reach you, and you're ingesting it. You're drinking the water that someone else is giving you, right? And so being able to show that and to model that, not to perform it, but to show that you are listening and that you're engaged in the process of listening, because listening is it's a verb, it's a doing, it's an active, it's an active element. It's something you have to be doing rather than passively doing, is really, really important. But then also, sometimes it's necessary to be able to verbally let the other person know in a response that you have been listening. And this is where we get to play back or to paraphrase. That's where paraphrasing kind of comes in, right? Where you're putting your understanding of what's just been said in your own words. So this kind of paraphrasing is often the higher kind of watermark of testing your understanding in any kind of conversation or information that you've received. And proof that someone has been listening, proof that, if I wasn't listening, I wouldn't be able to tell you what I'm about to tell you. And this is my understanding. Can I play it back to you? Sometimes even indicating it and signposting it like that can be a very, very a useful communication kind of tool as well, to let someone know you've been listening, to let them know that you've been empathetic and that you've been generous with your time as well. Here's what I've taken from this. And it's a great way to often, fast track some relationship building, especially if you're in a business context. But this kind of active listening is also, what we do in schools since time immemorial, right? When we test for listening, they just call it comprehension, right? Can you comprehend what you've heard, what you've received as information? So being able to be aware of both how to listen physically, and how to show that you're listening and how to play back what you've listened to is absolutely essential, perhaps even the most essential part of being a good and a kind of a decent conversationalist, because you're engaged in the process of listening and you can show that you have been listening and it allows the other person to feel listened to. That's why, great conversations in the way that they've been, in the way that we remember them, are always with people who are like, gosh, that person really listened to me. There was a sense of back and forth. There was an exchange in sensory information because I felt like you really heard my words. You really heard what I had to say. And that's such a strong, psychologically powerful kind of area to be able to tap into or just be aware of. Because when we're listening, we're showing empathy, we're showing curiosity, we're being open, we're being vulnerable, we're willingly spending our time there, and it allows the other person to feel safe and ultimately get deeper into what they want to say, what they want to express, and just makes the quality and the value of the conversation that much more important and more efficient as well as a process. So listening, practice listening, show that you're listening, And where you can and where it's necessary, let the other person know what you've listened to. How can you paraphrase what you've heard? And finally, our last bit, even though listening, you can argue, is the most essential part of the conversation in terms of a skill, the most important lubricant, if you like, in any conversation is always curiosity. It's always about surprise. It's always about being able to move into a space together willingly where you're trying to determine what don't we know and what are we trying to learn more about here. It's an essential ingredient in any kind of exploratory conversation. And if it's not there in hopefully generous amounts being shared by everybody, the entire point of having a conversation is moot. If you know, and if you think you know what you know already, and you're not willing to budge, or you're not willing to learn more, or to be curious about something, there's nothing to learn here. There's nothing to test, or to experiment, or to verify, or to clarify, right? There's no point in conversation. There's no new meaning to make. And so, goodbye. That's it, right? It's precisely because we don't know things, or we're trying to get a better grasp on something, that we enjoy the process of being in conversation with someone to try and make new meaning, and why it's valuable and enjoyable. Because we're trying to create a new experience or new knowledge here where previously there was none, or maybe very little. So leaving behind your assumptions, being open, being curious, being willing to move into a space where it's okay to be ignorant, and it's okay to put up your hand and say, you know what, I don't know. Let's start there. Let's open ourselves up to what might be possible, is always going to be such an important ingredient in having a good conversation, but not just having a good conversation for fun, but really being able to open yourself up to learning, to not taking an assumption for granted, because you are now going to show up as your willing self. And that is how you get your cup filled. That's where you learn things. That's where knowledge appears in the face of ignorance, I suppose. So a willing ignorance, a willing curiosity is always going to help you as someone who is interested in learning more, someone who is generous to be in conversation with as well, because you are always in conversation, making something inside out with someone else. And if you can show that you are entering the no assumptions zone, it is also an invitation to the other person for them to understand, okay, I'm going to enter into the no assumptions zone here too. And we're going to see what happens. And we're going to allow the process of conversation to do its thing, because that's what this technology has helped us to do for hundreds of thousands of years. It helps us to make new meaning. And with a couple of these principles, with a couple of these things, perhaps with some of your own as well, thrown in there with a whole dose of experience and practice and trying it out, I think we have a shot not just at keeping important conversations alive, but also understanding, where we're not looking. What are the conversations we're not having and perhaps should be? I hope this has been useful for you, and I hope you've enjoyed the conversation back and forth between you and I on how to think clearly about having good conversations, the value they bring, the role they play in our life and the meaning of life, why they're enjoyable and why they're infinitely valuable in helping us to determine what we need to do, the decisions we make, who we need to trust, how we can trust, and ultimately making life that much more worth living. Thanks for listening. I hope to see you again soon on the podcast. We'll have another one next time with another guest. But let me know if you've enjoyed this style of episode. I'll try and make a couple more of these available in the near future. Take care. Check us out, what we're doing on humblemind.co for more. And I'll see you again soon.